give the stage to Maikel Kuijpers, and I think we stay in the topic, but shift more to archaeology. Whatever. Yeah. It's always a mixture today, so I'm.
It is a mixture indeed.
Hello, Maikel, and
hello.
Can you share your?
Yeah. Good. So thank you for the invitation to give a keynote in this session on skill embodiment and the growth of knowledge. And thank you to Marie and the other organizers. Must have been pretty intense to constantly be adapting to the situation. I think you organized about 3 conferences by now. I thought it would be interesting to approach this topic actually first from a more general perspective before I go into an actual archaeological example. And I want to do this by highlighting a recent development, the emergence of a new academic field, namely the history of knowledge. And I will also show a few non-academic examples to highlight in what way the topics that we are researching play a role in contemporary society. But this I will leave to the end of the presentation. In between, the main part of the presentation is an archaeological example of how to study skill. And this is based on my book, An Archaeology of Skill. And we will be looking at Bronze Age craftsmanship, so metalworking skills. And there I will argue that technical knowledge is in fact skill, and looking at Bronze Age access from Central Europe in particular. So I will show how we can empirically assess skill in the archaeological record. So that will be the plan for the next 20 minutes or so. Okay, let's start. First, more general context. Actually, end of 2018, I was invited by Dagmar Schäfer as a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. And traditionally, these fields, history, history of science, history of technology, they've been heavily text-based, of course. But increasingly, historians are recognizing the importance of the materials and objects themselves. I mean, we had a wonderful talk yesterday by Timothy Lecain exploring this. He called it neo-materialism. And this is a very interesting development. So what exactly is happening here? Well, I think we actually see 2 fields slowly merging, 2 fields that I was told were operating largely independently. So the history of science and the history of technology. And history of technology was basically considered sort of applied science. And this is, of course, a bit of a false distinction, and one of the underlying reasons why these developments are taking place. So what we see happening is that they are merging into this larger overarching field, which is called the history of knowledge. And this is a relatively new field, and it opened up an enormous span of time to historians. After all, knowledge is not just what is written in books. In fact, the largest part of human history, knowledge, was embodied knowledge. I would argue that sort of skill was the main form of knowledge about materials in most of human history. So this is one of the reasons why archaeologists are getting more involved. And personally, I really appreciate such mixing of disciplines. But merging archaeology and archaeological methods with history does obviously also create some tension. Now, tension generally means, I think generally tension means that things are getting very interesting. So here I have a few examples that just show you how the field is developing. In 2015, it was sort of an attempt to define it. And you have the Journal for the History of Knowledge, which just started this year. And then this book by one of the directors of the Max Planck, which came out a few months ago, Evolution of Knowledge. So this is very interesting work. And just to give you an example of how these fields are merging, we want to show this one. The History of Knowledge School is sort of developing their own version of what we would call experimental archaeology. So this year is the Making and Knowing Lab that is run by Professor Pamela Smith at Columbia University. And next to reading and studying historic documents on the making of certain things, they have started this lab in which the recipes are actually tested and reproduced. So it's an experimental approach, one could say. And I also predict that, for instance, the chaîne à prétoire, well known to us, will slowly be adopted here, because it's one of the few methodologies that allows us to draw information on knowledge and skill from artifacts. And it's also an excellent way of sort of documenting and analyzing the different steps in that it takes to make an object. So in this area of the history of knowledge, academic compartmentalization is disappearing, and that's a very positive development. And this conference, I believe, is another example involving historians, archaeologists, anthropologists. And to a large extent, this all relates to this so-called material turn that we are experiencing. So I think that sort of in the background, we're all familiar with this kind of literature. So that's to sort of capture the more general context in which we're working, and also to show that we as archaeologists are not alone in the quest to explore the development of knowledge over time. But now for some deep history or skill in the archaeological record. So any reconstruction of the resource technical knowledge requires that we first define what we mean when we talk about knowledge and how we can access this knowledge through material remains. And this empirical approach is important because too easily we are ascribing skill to prehistoric craftspeople and drawing all kinds of interpretations from this observation. So for instance, Bronze Age research, the notion of skill is employed to build a model of political economy. But nowhere is skill actually addressed rather than assumed on the basis of our appreciation of particular artifacts and metalworking in general. So we're not progressing beyond these kind of assumptions that I've shown here. So just as an example. So my intention is to develop a more formalized and empirical approach to assess skill. And here's how we are going to do this. First, the framework. So we need to have some sort of definition of skill if we want to show it in the archaeological data. Then we need to figure out how we can draw observations from a very specific kind of data, archaeometallurgical data. And then the results, which are visualized in this sort of updated chaîne à prétoire, which very much looks like a network. So I define skill on the basis of 4 fundamental characteristics. And these generalizations that you read here, I've drawn from a study of craftspeople, both in the past and the present. So I've actually employed what Trevor just mentioned, sort of, to look at ethnographic examples, but also just modern craftspeople in our current society to understand what skill is about. And that goes from reading Agricola to making a documentary about modern craftspeople. And these were sort of the points that I found consistently. So in short, you could say craft skill is a dialogue between maker and material that develops through a recursive, experiential, approximating process. And that it is based on the senses is a very important observation. So this sensorial aspect is crucial. It's phenomenology, you might say, or you could also see this, as was mentioned yesterday, as a kind of animism. So the way how craftspeople speak about the materials is that they listen to them, they follow their materials. And to show you why this matters, I have here an example of the dichotomy that we're often struggling with as archaeologists and that we need to tackle. So there are actually two knowledge identities at play here, that of material science and that of craft. And these do not necessarily match up very well. So one of the material scientists, they tend to speak of properties, but craftspeople, when you listen to them, they tend to speak of qualities of a material and how the material behaves. And that leads to differences as the ones that you can see here. So this comment on how heating took place to restore deformability due to grain growth and stress relief. And then during a metalworking workshop, so that's a definition of annealing in the material sciences. But during a metalworking workshop, when I asked the metalworker, like, oh, why are you annealing? You know, because it's about this crystal growth, and I was going into all this science, and he was just looking at me and saying, look, the metal needs to relax. And thinking about that comment, I thought, like, well, actually, that's a really, really good way of describing what happens on a molecular level. Because this is what the metal indeed does. It sort of relaxes when you anneal it, you can work it again. Another example would be that complicated formula of roasting ore, sulfidic ore, and that actually smells like rotten egg. So, and I can tell you this is very, very sensorial. It really does smell like rot. It stings, basically. But that actually is a sign that your process is going well. So what I try to do in my work is to bring these together, because I was convinced that this is possible. After all, material scientists and craftspeople are not describing different realities. You know, they're simply describing reality differently. So it's a matter of metaphors, it's a matter of acuity. And these qualities that we have here are simply a sensorial reading of material properties. So here's another example of that gap that we sort of need to vault. When we look at the data being produced on metallurgy, it's, you know, compositional analysis, it's isotopes, it's these these metallographic samples. And what matters in this type of research is, of course, accuracy, preciseness, and detail. But then when you look at metalworking as a craft, what we actually see is it's messy, it's approximation, it's very pragmatic. So those are the two worlds that we want to join, actually. We need to vault this gap. And to do this, so to incorporate this, to operationalize this idea, I started working with what I call perceptive categories. And perceptive categories emphasize the qualities, behavior, and performance of materials that are important to craftspeople, and attempts to associate these with the properties and the processes for which scientific measurements are available. And incorporating this in the chain apparatoires allows us to see skill, because you add actually the how. So I would say a chain apparatoire shows you the what. It tends to show you in steps what was done to an artifact, sort of a yes/no option. Was an axe hammered? Yes or no? Was it annealed? Yes or no? That's what a normal chain apparatoire would show. And then what you add with the perceptive categories is how it was done, how it was recognized, how people recognized that they were working with different types of metal. And if you hammer an axe, whether you have hammered it very lightly or very forcefully, which really matters in the outcome. And here's a preview of how that will look. And I know this looks very complex. And I'll try to explain this over the next few slides. So what you see here is actually a chaîne opératoire that has become a kind of a network in which it's not just a step-by-step sort of yes-no documentation of a technology, but in fact, it's more like a flow chart that sort of in which you can see, in which there are over 150,000 options possible to create an X in this case. And plotting 30 axes in here on each side, we see two very clear trends. So you can see that they're very distinct. And that's because they start with two very different types of metal, which I've called type 3 and type 5. Or better, these are two different perceptive categories of metal. So let me try to explain this. Let me unpack this a little bit, and then we will come back to this slide. So copper composition is a measurement of elements to us, to the archaeometallurgists. It's about the amount of tin in there, or antimony, or arsenic. So that's how we see composition, or archaeometallurgists see composition. But composition to metal workers, to craftspeople, is actually about color. Now, we know this from working with modern metal workers, but we also know this from archaeological, for instance, and even in metallurgical textbooks up until the 19th century. Composition was described in terms of color. So color is a really crucial perceptive category here to understand composition. And what we can do with this is actually we can quantify this quality. So the colors that copper alloys take when you add different elements. And this is what I've been doing together with Marianne Müdlinger. And effectively what you are looking at here in this quantifying of color is funnily enough, it's sort of a quantitative phenomenology taking place here. So I've used these measurements to group copper compositions and to group them quite differently from what was normally done in archaeometallurgical research. So I mostly did it on the basis of colors, but I also took into account several other qualities of this material. So sensorial qualities, sensorial aspects, so how the metal behaves. And then type 3 would be, as you can see, a rather rough group, or a coarse group, where I say, look, type 3 is copper with tin, but everything between 5 and 12% tin falls in that group. And the qualities it has, it gets golden when you polish it, it has good casting qualities, it's a quite predictable material. And then type 5 would be copper that actually has arsenic, antimony, nickel, and silver in there, which is distinctly different metal. It behaves very differently. Hard, but exceedingly brittle, high risk of hot shorts. So this is how I try to sort of make a different kind of categorization. And I understand that this categorization is far less detailed than a scientific one, like the SAM studies, for instance. But I would argue that this is a more realistic one that is more relevant to craftspeople. So to put it very simply, perceptive categories help us to organize, to categorize the data in a way that quite literally makes sense. And now hopefully this complex drawing also makes a little bit more sense. So what you see here is actually that Bronze Age metalworkers were recognizing these differences between type 3 and type 5 metal and working them differently, which is why you have different kind of when we analyzed it. So to a craftsperson, it is not a necessity to precisely understand what causes a raw material to perform in a certain manner and why. What matters is that they recognize the relevant changes and act upon them. And that's a very small but important nuance, because instead of assuming that there must be science behind craft, I only assume experience. So here's sort of the process that I try to explain now in summary. So we start with Bronze Age axes from Central Europe. There's scientific data available for this, so archaeometallurgical metallographic samples. I take that data, but organize it and categorize it according to these perceptive categories. And then I plot them in this sort of updated Chenin repertoire. So that's my methodology that I've employed in my PhD. Then on to some results. So some other results than the general one that I showed you already. What you can also do, of course, is plot individual axes in this sort of Chenin repertoire flowchart. So here we have two very similar looking axes. Typologically, archaeologists have put them under the same header. So both these are known as type Saxon axes. But interestingly, if we plot the metallographic data, so the production of these axes, via perceptive categories, we actually see something interesting happen. We see this. So we plot one axe, which goes like this, at type 3, casting qualities low, weak shaping, strong annealing, exceptional hemohardening. I apologize, it's probably not readable. But that's when you get these complex sort of networks. Point is, you plot the other axe, you can see, whoa, it's produced very, very differently. It also seems that in terms of hardness, which is this line, it has an inferior hardness compared to the other one. So what is going on here? And then the context is interesting also here. So the blue line is an axe from a grave, and the red one is an axe from a hoard. Now, so purpose might play a role here too, but most interestingly, looking at production, we actually need to sort of rethink whether our typologies are correct, because I would argue that these are two different axes instead of the same type. Then a second example of the results that you will get. Here we have 3 axes from one and the same hoard, which is Prachi. And when we plot these in this Chenin repertoire and look at the production, we can actually see this. We have one axe which is very skilled. It was focused on hardness, and we can say that because we can see very strong hemohardening leading to a superior hardness. And when I say superior hardness, that's in comparison to all the 300 other axes that I've looked upon. So I compare it with basically with the standard of the time. Then there's the second axe, roughly the same, also seems to be focused on creating a hard axe. So the head of the axe, the blade, was hammered a lot. And then you have this third one, which is completely out of place, it seemed. So it's not hammer hardened, not at all. It didn't get any surface treatment. You could say, well, this is perhaps an unskilled axe. It could obviously also have been done on purpose, but in terms of, I would interpret it in terms of skill. What it shows us, at least, is that again, even though these 3 axes look very similar, they are not. In terms of production, they are not. In terms of skill, they are not. And those are interesting observations, I think. So to conclude this this part. These are just a few examples of the results that you get when you focus on skill. And I would summarize sort of the more general conclusions as follows. What does skill bring about? Well, I would argue it brings about mostly diversity. And the concept of specialist that we are very keen on using is actually particularly insensitive to to show this diversity. You know, when we all call these metalworkers specialists, you can't capture this diversity. And then a more tentative conclusion is also asking, well, what does bronze do? Well, the direction I think that this technology is set, it's set out in a dialogue between material and maker. So it's partly guided by the material. And this actually refers to the point that Timothy was making yesterday. So the resource, the material, is actually influencing how people think, which means making metal is making Bronze Age mines. Let's see, do I have 5 minutes left?
3 minutes, maybe?
3 minutes, that's fine, I can do it. So I just...
Thank you, Maikel.
Also wanted to have a few notes on why we should be doing this kind of research, or why is it important actually that we all study skill and resources. And there are 3 arguments that I would like to make for this. First, understanding and appreciation of skill, and skill I think is most visible in craft work. There are several good reasons why we should make it part of a general education once more nowadays. You know, if only to counter some of the political polarization that is happening on the basis of educational backgrounds. Now, I will not go into this too much. We have Trevor with us, and I'm sure he would be happy to address this in more detail in the discussion. So, but this is first argument. Understanding skill as a knowledge form, I think, is important also for modern education. Secondly, there's something really fascinating about particular techniques and craft skills. So this is an interesting find from a colleague of mine in Leiden. It's called a lissoir. It's a leatherworking tool. Now, if you go online, you can buy, and this is a Neanderthal tool. If you go online, you can buy exactly the same tool. Now, this immensely deep past of particular tools and techniques, I think it's fascinating. And this one, this modern one, is actually, normally they're made for plastic, but if you ask leatherworking craftspeople, they would say, well, actually one made from bone, from a cow's rib, is the best one. And this one, the Neanderthal one, is actually made from, well, not a cow's rib, of course, you didn't have cows, but a bovine kind of animal. And to make it even more interesting, my colleague Marie took this tool, this archaeological tool, to a modern factory in France, where they produce these very posh Hermes leather bags. And there, the craftspeople instantly recognized and appreciated that tool, even though there is about 50,000 years between them. So there's something really powerful in this, I think. You know, if a Neanderthal and a French mademoiselle are able to understand each other, you know, to communicate via the material and the tools, then craftsmanship offers us a fantastic way to incorporate the foreign. You know, craft is a communication via the material. So I think that's a very powerful idea behind this type of research. And finally, lastly, how we deal with resources and materials is also very much a present concern. So we are not in a particularly good situation, I would argue. And to understand how we got there and what got us so dependent on particular materials, that's very important knowledge to have. So this is also a topic that I'm writing a series on for a journalistic medium. And frankly, I've been really quite overwhelmed with the response to this. So people are very worried, and especially people are looking for alternatives. So for instance, architects returning to building with wood, straw and clay. So they're looking to the work of Trevor, for instance, in Mali and Yemen, and they're delving into the history and archaeology of materials to get inspired and use different kinds of resources and materials. So there's really a lot of momentum going on right now for the kind of research that we are doing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It was really a wonderful presentation. And I think now I'm waiting for the clapping. And there is a question by Thomas Stöllner. We just 1 or 2 questions, okay, and then we move to the coffee break. Otherwise.
Yeah, Michael, thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. So I'm a little bit coming back to your metal skill operatoire, and I have noticed you're starting with the metal composition, but would it not be good to start with the ore itself? Because if you think on prehistoric material properties and learning about the raw source, then this idea of getting also acquainted to the ore by using it, by exploiting it, is also something which could inherit also with the narrative on the material. And of course you could argue it's a gap between having a metal on the one hand and having the ore on the other. So I could understand this, especially for more, let's say, bigger productions. I could follow that. This is one part of my question. The other one is a little bit to this Czech hoard you have developed to us. And of course you do see there is different stage of working as well. So how you deal with that if you have, so to say, different stages of working. I completely agree with you that there is, our typology is not any longer a good way to describe things. So so this is what I mean. So the temporality of working with material within your skill operatoire, so to say, I would call it this way.
Oh, that's a nice one, a skill operatoire. That I like. Let's see, so 2 questions. The first one I would answer, I mean, yes, you're right. To make a complete operatoire, it would be better to start from the ores. But I assumed that actually what was mostly happening was recycling, so that people would not, that most metal workers would not start with ore, but actually with a broken artifact or an ingot, where ores were already mixed. So this is why I start this skill operatoire with copper composition. But I mean, yeah, you could add 1 level on top of that and work from ores. As to your second question, let's see, the pressure hoard, yes. Whether it's, your question was whether it would be particular stages that we see?
Yeah, I remember the work of Tobias Kinlin, of course, you know it quite well. And he also brought out some very interesting observation on the same level you did. And what I was thinking, okay, if you have these hoard, okay, you could also see it's not a matter of having a final product, of course, in the hoard. So there is also stages. And what I mean is how you describe this skill, this skill part of knowledge on the object within, of course, it's, you can argue the one which is not that worked and not that has not the hardness you have in your, is still not worked finally to the end and not at the end to be used possibly. And it's possibly not a complete different tool. So it's just on the way to be a tool to be used, or it's good to have it in this way, in this stage. However, so how you bring this argument or these aspects in your skill operatoire?
Yeah. Well, yes, this is indeed first to recognize actually the work of Tobias Kinlin. This is indeed many of the archaeometallurgical data that I was using is from his work. So I just sort of, I reanalyzed it using these perceptive categories and added other kinds of analysis to it. So I went back to all these axes also to study them. So that's to recognize actually his work, which is important. And And then as for your question, this is very complex. This is very difficult, of course. You could also argue that instead of that we're seeing differences in skill here, what you actually see is a unfinished artifact. So they stopped before finishing it because that was fine and they could put it in the hoard. I mean, well, because I was interested in skill and devised the entire technology around skill, this is why I interpret it as differences in skill. But you're absolutely right that you could interpret it differently. So I guess what we, at the very least, what we could say is that it's a very interesting observation to make that these three axes, or at least this one outlier is in there. And whether it's unfinished or whether it's just an unskillful amateur who made it, okay, that's interpretation, but the observation to begin with is an interesting one. Like, why aren't there three finished axes in that hoard? Why is there one outlier? And this is not the only example that I have. You know, there are several examples of this in hoards. I hope that answers your question.
Nikos, I do not see you. But is it possible to shift your question to the final discussion and so everybody can take a coffee?
Yeah, it can. Yeah, of course.
Is it okay? Or I think you're having the broader question as usual.
No, this is a very specific one.
Okay, so go ahead. Specific ones ahead.
I have my coffee.
Okay, so Maikel, sorry. Now I wanted to ask the following. Thank you very, very much. That's very interesting and very useful also when I teach these perceptive categories to the students. They like very much the idea of quantifying skills somehow. But the question that arises there, and I wanted to ask you is, when you have these different methods of creating an axe, okay, these different cenoperatoires, as you said, to create the same type of axe. These may, of course, be different crafting traditions for some reason or different purposes, but in any way, they reflect some kind of conscious choices by the craftsman. I gather this from what you said earlier about their ability to work with different colors, you know, to be aware of what they are doing. So if they do it differently, perhaps at least some of the times they mean it to do it differently because they have other functions. So my question is, there is a cognitive aspect here. There is an aspect of choice. So how do you combine these with your idea that skill is mostly sensorial, mostly a bodily, let's say, thing?
Yeah, this is a question about intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's again, it's quite difficult to actually distinguish this in axes. So it's difficult to distinguish simply seeing an amateur at work or thinking, well, this was an intentional choice. So very often I got the comment, for instance, when I went in a presentation when I showed a few axes that I thought were very poorly made. And I got the question of people saying, well, maybe it was on purpose, you know, maybe the crafty person was in a rush and on purpose made good enough axes. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's a possibility. That's I guess it's extremely hard for archaeologists to actually get at the intention.
Of course. Yeah.
So in a way, yeah, I can't really answer your questions. Yeah, it's a fair enough critique. I mean, if you really go into detail, it's interesting that sometimes you can, for instance, observe. I have, for instance, an axe that starts out really well. So very good casting quality, specific copper composition that seemed to be chosen for its qualities. And then suddenly in sort of the finishing of hammer hardening, it's complete crap. So it almost seems like the axe was handed over to someone to finish it, and that person made a mess out of it. But But I mean, I think it's interesting to look at it in that way, but these are very tentative, you know, really difficult observations to actually substantiate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it was not a critique, it was just a question to bring it into how the cognitive goes with the bodily. But we will discuss this at the end. So I don't want to insist on that because there's the coffee pending, and we'll discuss all these kinds of things at the end. Thank you very much,
I'll
Maikel.
think about it a bit more.
So thanks to all of you for the start already of a very interesting discussion. And I think Mark has a very specific question. Mark, is it a short question? Mark?
It's short, depending on the answer.
Okay, we are late already.
If Michael will be short, I'll be short. How about that? Is that a deal?
Okay.
Now, I just wanted to pick up on the point that was just made in the last discussion about whether these unfinished pieces are deliberate. Now, Michael will remember that at a seminar at Leiden, I presented some unfinished axes from a hoard in Italy, the Pieve Vignola hoard. And those unfinished axes were all of a different composition to the finished axes in the same hoard. So it's very, very clear that the craftsperson who made them, if it was a single craftsperson, knew the difference in the material and perhaps decided that the unfinished axes weren't axes, they were an ingot or something else, just a simple way of storing. So can we go back to what Nicholas was asking you? I mean, is the unfinished or the final form really about choice?
Yeah, so I started my PhD, of course, trying to answer skill, but then had to add a chapter on which I called X recipes, which actually tries to deal with this, so that you have different intentions, different choices leading to basically axes with a different purpose. Because this example that you mentioned of axes being in a hoard with a very different composition, worked very differently, plenty of examples of this. The Sales hoard, for instance, has a very peculiar composition. So I try to tackle this by arguing for X recipes, and the X ingot recipe would be one, but also an X gift, for instance. So the axes that go into hoards, which seems to be, in several cases, a very specific purpose that they knew and decided on from the very beginning when they started producing these axes.
Okay, I think Mark is satisfied with the answer, so he's not popping up again. So I would propose that we have 10 minutes where everybody can grab a coffee, a good coffee, not a conference coffee. And then we come back at 10:30. I know we are extremely late, but I think it's worth to have these discussions. Maya, are you agreeing?
I fully agree, especially with the coffee part.
Okay, so in 10 minutes, of course, the chat the meeting gonna be open if you want to discuss things. Everybody's free to do
yes,
so.
Zoom is open. Let's grab our coffee and come back then.
Thanks a lot, Michael. It was wonderful. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.